Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to my channel to not miss new videos. This happened many years ago, back in the mid-90s. I was at a bar with some friends, enjoying the usual night out. It was one of those places where you didn't expect much to happen, just a typical bar with loud music, overpriced drinks, and a mix of people you'd probably never talk to again. I was there with a girlfriend at the time, and a few of my buddies, just hanging out, minding my own business. Little did I know that a random drunk woman was about to turn everything upside down. I was at the bar, talking to a friend, when I felt something strange. Before I could even process it, I realized this woman, who had clearly had way too much to drink, was shoving her hands down the front of my pants. At first, I thought maybe I had misjudged the situation, but no. It was real. And it was happening. What did I do? I froze. I didn't know how to react. Everyone around me, my friends, random people at the bar, just stared. Some of them were laughing. I was in complete shock. To this day, I can't figure out if they were laughing because they thought it was funny, or if they were just so uncomfortable that they didn't know what else to do. I couldn't believe this was happening. I looked at my girlfriend, who had already turned her back to the situation, pretending it wasn't happening. I couldn't even process what was going on. It was like a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. As I'm standing there, trying to make sense of what was happening, the woman was relentless. She was so drunk that she couldn't even stand properly, which only made things worse. I kept trying to pull her hands away, but she wasn't budging. It was like she had zero awareness of the situation, and to be honest, at that point, neither did I. Who could have predicted something like this? It felt like the entire bar had gone silent except for the sound of my heart pounding in my chest. Now, you'd think that maybe someone would step in, right? Help me out here? But nope. Everyone around me, my so-called friends included, just stood there. Some of them even started laughing harder. I honestly couldn't believe it. I kept thinking, is this really happening? Am I being punked? It felt like I was in some bizarre, twisted version of reality. Eventually, the lady lost her balance and fell on her ass, and of course, because her hands were still down my pants, I fell on top of her. If I'm being honest, I felt trapped like a fly stuck in a web. At this point, I just wanted to escape, but the situation kept escalating. And the more I struggled, the more ridiculous it all became. I was trying to stay calm, trying to get her off me, but she was all over me. But no one was helping. No one was doing anything. I just couldn't believe it. And my girlfriend? She was in the middle of it all and didn't even seem to care. In fact, I think she was more focused on how embarrassed she was than how messed up this whole thing was. It was starting to hit me. I was completely on my own in this situation. At this point, I was beyond frustrated. I'd been trying to push this woman off of me for what felt like forever, and no one was helping. I was looking around, hoping that maybe someone would step in and pull her away, but instead, I was met with more laughter and stunned faces. I looked at my friends, hoping they'd come to my aid, but they were too busy laughing at the absurdity of the situation to offer any support. I felt like I was in a scene from some weird comedy show, but it wasn't funny. It was humiliating. My pants were halfway down my legs, and I was literally laying on top of some random woman who was groping me. But the worst part? My girlfriend was standing there, too, just watching. She didn't step in either. She just stood there, frozen, probably too embarrassed to even look at me. The longer I struggled, the more I realized just how out of control this was getting. Everyone around me was either too drunk to notice how messed up it was or, worse, they thought it was hilarious. I could feel my face burning with anger and humiliation. It was like everyone was in on some joke, and I was the punchline. In that moment, something snapped in me. I couldn't just keep standing there, letting this woman, who clearly had no idea what she was doing, continuing to grope me like it was some kind of joke. I was done being polite. Done hoping someone would step in. It was clear no one cared. I had to take matters into my own hands. So, I did what I had to do. I punched the woman, not hard, but enough to get her attention. I forced her hands out of my pants and, using whatever strength I had left, I pushed her away from me. I didn't care what anyone thought anymore. It was either that or be stuck in this absurd situation forever. But even after that, I could still feel the eyes of everyone around me, staring, some with judgment, some with disbelief. That's when I knew this night was going to end badly. As soon as I pushed her away, the room seemed to freeze. The laughter died down, but the awkward silence that replaced it was almost worse. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, and I immediately regretted the action, even though I knew deep down it was the only thing I could do to get out of that nightmare. But what happened next? That's what really got to me. Some of the people around me, especially a few of my friends, started to voice their disapproval. One guy, who I thought was a good friend, looked at me like I was the villain in this whole situation. He shook his head and muttered something under his breath about how I shouldn't have hit a woman. Another one of my friends, who had been laughing just moments earlier, now looked at me like I was some kind of monster. "Dude, why'd you punch her?" he asked, his voice dripping with judgment. "She was just drunk." I couldn't believe it. Was I the only one who saw how messed up this whole thing was? How was I supposed to handle it? Was I supposed to just let her keep going? But in that moment, it wasn't about whether I'd been right or wrong. The point was that no one seemed to care about the fact that I'd been violated in front of a crowd of people. No one seemed to care that I had been put in an impossible situation. All that mattered was that I'd physically reacted, and apparently, that was the unforgivable part. My girlfriend at the time? Yeah, she wasn't having it either. She looked absolutely furious. She wasn't angry at the woman, or at the situation. I was the one she was angry with. She didn't say a word to me, but the look on her face was enough to know I'd messed up. That look stayed with me as I tried to escape from the whole circus. I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd have my back, but no. Instead, I was the one being scrutinized. I wanted to say something, anything, to defend myself, but there was nothing I could say that would make any of them understand. So, I kept quiet, trying to make myself as small as possible. I was humiliated, furious, and honestly, just exhausted. I had just been assaulted by a random stranger, and now I was being treated like the villain. What had started as a night of hanging out with friends had turned into an absolute nightmare. I realized then that no one around me was going to help me or even attempt to understand. I was on my own. And the worst part? I didn't know how to fix any of it. I couldn't go back to how things were before this happened. The moment I decided to leave was more of a retreat than anything else. I could feel my face burning with shame as I gathered my things and made a quick exit. The entire bar was still buzzing with murmurs, and I could hear snippets of conversations, some people still laughing, others questioning what had just happened. It felt like I was the focus of everyone's judgment, and honestly, I couldn't blame them. In that moment, I probably looked just as ridiculous as the situation had been. I walked out to the parking lot, hoping that maybe some fresh air would clear my head, but it didn't. It only made me more aware of how messed up everything had become. My mind was racing. How had things gotten so out of control? I'd done nothing to deserve this. Yet, here I was, alone and walking away from a night that I'd never be able to erase from my memory. I was angry, confused, and hurt by how no one seemed to care about the real issue, which was that I had been assaulted. The worst part was how my girlfriend reacted. She followed me out to the parking lot, but instead of comforting me or trying to understand, she ripped into me. She was furious that I'd punched the woman. She couldn't see past the fact that I'd physically reacted. She didn't care that I'd been the one violated. In her eyes, I was the one who had caused the drama. I tried to explain, tried to tell her what had really happened, but she wasn't hearing it. All she could focus on was how she felt about the whole thing, how embarrassed she was. And that stung. It hurt more than I can even put into words. I was supposed to be the one she supported, right? But here I was, standing in the parking lot, trying to defend myself, and she couldn't even listen. She was too wrapped up in her own embarrassment to care about what I'd gone through. It was like I was invisible to her in that moment. It made me feel alone, more alone than I'd ever felt in that relationship. And honestly, looking back, I should have known that was a sign of something deeper. But at the time, I was too caught up in trying to salvage the night. I ended up driving home in silence, not even knowing if we were still together. My thoughts were all over the place. Could I have handled things differently? Should I have just let it go and hoped someone else would step in? But deep down, I knew there was no other option. I couldn't let that woman continue, and I couldn't just stand there and let it happen. I was drained, emotionally and physically. And as I drove through the empty streets, I realized that I was now dealing with the aftermath of a situation that no one else seemed to take seriously. I was the one left to carry the weight of it all. The next few days were awkward, to say the least. I tried to move on, tried to brush the whole thing off as just one of those ridiculous things that happens when you're out drinking and minding your own business. But the more I thought about it, the more the whole situation gnawed at me. How could people, including my friends, just stand by and do nothing? How could they laugh while something like that was happening to me? It felt like I was the only one who cared about what had really transpired. As for my girlfriend, well, things didn't improve much between us after that night. She stayed mad at me for a long time, and honestly, I wasn't sure how to fix things. Every time I tried to talk to her about it, she got defensive, talking about how I'd overreacted. She couldn't seem to grasp that, in that moment, I had been in real distress. I wasn't some guy trying to make a scene, I was just trying to survive a situation that had spiraled out of control. But instead of understanding that, she only saw me as the problem. Eventually, I realized that she wasn't the one for me. If someone can't be there for you when you're in a mess of a situation like that, then what good are they in the long run? Her focus on how she felt in that moment rather than supporting me showed me that our relationship wasn't as solid as I had hoped. The emotional betrayal I felt from her was the final nail in the coffin for us. As for my friends, well, they weren't much better. Some of them apologized later, saying they hadn't known how to react, that they didn't want to make things worse. But others didn't even bother. A few of them even avoided me for weeks, probably because they were uncomfortable with what had happened. It's funny how quickly people who claim to be your friends can turn their backs on you when things get messy. The people I thought I could count on the most were nowhere to be found when I really needed them. In the end, I walked away from both the relationship and some of those friendships. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the right one. I realized that I had been surrounded by people who, in the moment of crisis, showed me exactly who they were and who they weren't. What's crazy is how everything had been so simple before that night. A night out with friends. But one twisted moment of chaos changed everything. It made me question everything I thought I knew about the people in my life. It showed me that when things go wrong, you really see who's willing to have your back and who's just along for the ride. And it was a harsh wake-up call. After everything settled down, I spent a lot of time reflecting on the whole experience. It wasn't just about what happened that night, it was about the people around me, the way they reacted or didn't react, and what it said about them, and ultimately, about me. I realized that I had been too focused on keeping the peace and keeping people happy, even at the expense of my own well-being. Looking back, I can see now that I let myself get dragged into that situation without setting any boundaries. I let myself be surrounded by people who didn't have my back when it mattered most. I thought I was being the cool guy by just rolling with things and not making a big deal out of them. But in the end, that mindset only made me vulnerable to situations like this. I'd spent years trying to maintain relationships with people who didn't value me the way I should have been valued. My friends who laughed it off, my girlfriend who was more concerned about her own embarrassment, they were all showing me who they really were, even if I hadn't been ready to see it. The truth was, I had been settling for relationships where I wasn't treated with the respect I deserved. I had been trying to fit into a mold that wasn't truly me. It took me a long time to fully process the emotional betrayal that came from people who were supposed to be closest to me. I realized that it wasn't just the woman at the bar who had crossed a line, it was the people who enabled her behavior, who watched and did nothing, who made me feel small and ashamed in a moment when I needed help. It was hard to swallow, but I had to come to terms with the fact that sometimes, the people we expect the most from are the ones who disappoint us the most. That experience shifted my perspective on relationships, both romantic and friendships. I came to understand that respect and support aren't optional. They're necessary. If I'm going to have people in my life, they need to be people who will stand up for me, just as I'd stand up for them. I also learned something else about myself: I'm not a doormat. I'm not someone who should just roll over when things get uncomfortable or awkward. I'm not someone who should let other people's laughter or discomfort dictate how I handle a situation. I have the right to stand up for myself and demand respect. That's not something I'd always believed before, but after this experience, I realized that I deserved better. So, in a way, as painful as the whole situation was, it was also a wake-up call. A tough lesson learned, but an important one. I'll never look at relationships the same way again. Now, I know that if someone isn't willing to stand by me when I need them, they don't belong in my life. It might have taken a bizarre, humiliating moment to make me see that, but in the end, I'm better for it. And that's something I'd never trade. As I moved forward from that night, I started making changes in my life. It wasn't easy. Cutting ties with people I'd once called friends, letting go of a relationship I thought was solid, it felt like I was shedding a part of myself, a part that I had outgrown but didn't fully realize until that moment. It was like waking up from a long, foggy dream and seeing things clearly for the first time. I stopped putting up with bullshit. No more pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. If someone disrespected me, I didn't sit back and wait for them to apologize. I called it out. It wasn't about being confrontational for the sake of it, but about demanding respect for myself. I realized that the only way to stop people from walking all over me was to make it clear that I wouldn't stand for it. I started distancing myself from the people who had let me down. I'm not saying I cut everyone out of my life, but I began to set healthier boundaries. I realized that not every friendship or relationship was meant to last. I could have kept pretending, kept swallowing the resentment and anger, but what would that have done? It would have kept me stuck in the same cycle, allowing people who didn't value me to keep taking advantage of my time and energy. And as for my ex-girlfriend, well, that relationship was over. At first, I thought I'd been crazy for wanting to let it go. After all, we'd been together for a while, and there were a lot of good memories. But then I looked at what had happened that night, and I realized something: if she truly cared about me, she would have been there for me. She would have stood by me when I needed someone to have my back, not chastised me for reacting to a situation that was out of my control. I didn't need someone who only cared about how she felt. I needed someone who could see things from my perspective, who would support me through thick and thin. Walking away from her wasn't easy. It took time, but I knew it was the right decision. The person I had become, someone who was starting to stand up for himself and demand respect, wasn't someone she would ever understand. And I couldn't be with someone who couldn't see my worth. I also realized that, at the end of the day, I was the only person responsible for my own happiness. No one else could make me feel better about myself. If I kept relying on others to validate me, I'd always be at the mercy of their moods and opinions. But once I started valuing myself, once I started recognizing my own worth, everything shifted. I stopped letting the opinions of others dictate how I saw myself. Sure, it wasn't an overnight change. It took time, reflection, and a lot of tough decisions. But by letting go of people who didn't deserve a place in my life and embracing the idea that I was worthy of respect, I found a new sense of confidence. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was starting to thrive. And that, in the end, is the resolution I came to: it's not about the people who let you down, it's about how you pick yourself up after the fall. Years have passed since that night, and to be honest, I still think about it from time to time. The initial sting of betrayal and confusion has faded, but the lessons I learned have stuck with me. The impact of that night wasn't just a temporary feeling of embarrassment or frustration, it became a turning point in how I approached relationships and how I viewed myself. The most profound change for me was realizing that I could no longer tolerate being passive in situations where my well-being and self-respect were at stake. I had spent so much of my life trying to avoid conflict or keep the peace, but that night showed me that sometimes, standing up for yourself is the only way to move forward. It wasn't just about fighting back physically in that moment, it was about finding the strength to assert my boundaries and make sure people understood that I wouldn't let them walk over me. I also realized that the people you surround yourself with say a lot about who you are, and vice versa. It's easy to get caught up in a cycle of maintaining relationships just for the sake of having them. But after that experience, I started to see who was really worth keeping around. I cut ties with people who were toxic or indifferent to my struggles. Some of them fought back, saying I was being too harsh or too sensitive, but in the end, I knew I had to make space for people who genuinely cared. As for my future relationships, I became more cautious. I wasn't going to make the same mistake again of blindly trusting someone without knowing if they truly had my back. My standards for love and friendship were raised. I wanted someone who would support me, stand by me, and, most importantly, respect me. No more settling for people who couldn't see my worth. But, here's the thing, it wasn't all bad. That night, as crazy as it was, pushed me to grow. It made me rethink who I was and what I stood for. It helped me shed the parts of myself that were too passive, too forgiving in situations that didn't deserve it. And though it was painful, it was necessary. Because, in the long run, I became stronger for it. I became someone who knew their own value. There are times, though, when I still think about my ex-girlfriend and wonder how she's doing. I used to feel regret, but now I don't. If she was truly meant to be in my life, things would have turned out differently. The fact that she couldn't support me in that moment said everything I needed to know. And if there's anything I've learned, it's that it's better to let go of relationships that don't nurture you than to keep holding on to something that was never meant to be. I've also had to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself. The way I handled that night wasn't perfect. There were moments where I could have reacted differently. But the most important thing was that I acted. I stood up for myself in a moment of chaos, and while it wasn't graceful or ideal, it was real. And I can respect myself for that. So, as I look back on everything that happened, I realized that what I went through helped shape the person I am today. It forced me to stop tolerating bullshit, to learn my worth, and to never again let anyone treat me like I'm invisible. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. The truth is, life doesn't always go the way you plan. But how you respond to those unexpected moments, how you rise up and reclaim your dignity, that's what matters most. Looking back on all this, I wish someone had given me advice like this when I was younger. Maybe it's something I had to learn the hard way, but if you can take anything away from my story, let it be this: don't ever settle for people or situations that don't respect you. It sounds simple, but in the moment, it's easy to get caught up in wanting to please others or avoiding confrontation. But in the end, the only person you have to answer to is yourself. If you're in a situation where you're being treated poorly, whether it's by a friend, a partner, or anyone else, don't let it slide. That was my biggest mistake. I let things slide for far too long because I didn't want to cause problems or be seen as difficult. But in doing so, I allowed people to walk all over me, and that night was the wake-up call I needed to start taking myself seriously. Set your boundaries, and make them clear. People might try to push them, and that's when you have to stand firm. It doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you someone who respects themselves enough to demand the same respect from others. If someone's laughing at your expense or making you feel small, don't let them get away with it. Your time, your feelings, and your dignity matter. Another big piece of advice: don't be afraid to let go of relationships, whether they're friendships or romantic. I held on to my ex-girlfriend for way too long because I thought I was supposed to make it work. But sometimes, you realize that a relationship isn't worth saving if it's only bringing you frustration and pain. It's hard to walk away, but in the end, it's one of the most freeing things you can do. And don't be afraid to change. That night, I wasn't the same person I was when I walked into that bar. I realized that the way I had been living, trying to please everyone, letting people take advantage of me, wasn't working. The process of growing, of evolving into someone who takes themselves seriously, is tough, but it's necessary. It forces you to confront your weaknesses, your fears, and your insecurities. But it also allows you to become stronger, more confident, and more at peace with who you are. Lastly, don't let other people's opinions define your self-worth. After that night, I spent too much time worrying about what my friends thought, who I had disappointed, who I'd angered. But here's the truth: you can't control other people's reactions. You can only control how you respond to situations, and that's what matters most. If you're true to yourself and your values, the right people will stick around. I don't expect anyone to go through what I went through. But if you do, I hope you remember this: it's okay to be upset, it's okay to feel betrayed, and it's okay to stand up for yourself. Don't let anyone make you feel like your feelings aren't valid. Don't let anyone convince you that you don't deserve respect, that you don't deserve to be treated well. Because you do. The most important thing is this: never let anyone take away your dignity, and never let anyone convince you that you're not worthy of respect. It's a lesson I had to learn the hard way, but I'm glad I did. And if you can learn it sooner, I'd say you're already ahead. Looking back at that night, I realized that it wasn't just about the incident itself, but what came after. The way I was treated by others, the way I reacted, and how it all played out, it was all a catalyst for my own growth. At the time, I was too caught up in the chaos of that night to see it, but now I can look back and understand how deeply that experience shaped me. I had always been someone who avoided confrontation, who hated making waves, and who often let people walk all over me just to keep the peace. But that night showed me that sometimes, in order to maintain your integrity and self-worth, you have to create a little chaos. It was uncomfortable, sure, but it was also necessary. What really struck me, though, was how easily people were willing to turn a blind eye. It wasn't just the woman who did what she did, it was everyone around me, laughing, staring, or doing nothing. It felt like no one cared. At that moment, I realized something important: people are quick to judge, but very few are willing to step up when things go wrong. And sometimes, when you need help, you have to be the one to help yourself. If you wait around for someone else to do it, you could end up stuck, feeling helpless and powerless. That realization changed the way I viewed people. I learned that you can't rely on others to always have your back. You have to take responsibility for your own well-being. I stopped expecting others to do what I wasn't willing to do for myself. That night became a turning point for me, a moment where I had to decide whether I was going to continue being passive, or whether I was going to fight for myself. And as for the people who were supposed to have my back, who criticized me afterward, well, I learned who they really were. It wasn't just about the incident at the bar, it was about how they reacted to it. A true friend, a true partner, would have stood by me in that moment, not pointed fingers and judged me. It wasn't about the fact that I'd hit the woman, it was about the fact that I had stood up for myself, and they couldn't even respect that. That was the real betrayal. The whole experience forced me to face a lot of uncomfortable truths, both about myself and about the people I had surrounded myself with. And while it was painful at the time, it was the kind of painful that leads to growth. The man I am today is different. I'm not the same person I was that night, not the same person who felt small and powerless. I'm stronger, more confident, and more willing to stand up for what I believe in. I've learned to trust my instincts and to take care of myself, even when others won't. And, looking back, I'm actually grateful for that night, as twisted as it may sound. It showed me who I was, who I wasn't, and what I needed to change. It was the first step in a long journey of self-discovery and self-improvement. It wasn't easy. It wasn't glamorous. But it was necessary. Now that I've had time to reflect on everything, I realized that what happened that night had consequences that went beyond just my personal growth. There were things I didn't fully understand at the time, things I probably buried because it was easier to move on and not think too much about them. But eventually, those consequences caught up with me. The first consequence? The way it affected my relationships, particularly with women. I'm not proud of how I was perceived in the aftermath of that night. For a long time, I felt like I carried a label I didn't deserve. People saw me as that guy who hit a woman, and no amount of explaining or justifying could take that away. It wasn't even just the incident itself, it was the assumption that I was violent, that I didn't know how to handle myself in a confrontation. It made dating difficult for a while. I felt like I was constantly having to prove myself, constantly explaining that I wasn't some misogynist or woman beater. It was a weird paradox. I was trying to be the good guy, trying to show that I respected women, that I was just in an unfortunate situation, but the damage had already been done. People had made their judgments, and there was no easy way to undo that. I also realized how much my own sense of guilt played a role in this. For years, I let the weight of that moment hang over me. I'd replay it in my head, questioning if I had done the right thing or if I could have handled it better. But after a while, I started to realize that holding on to that guilt wasn't helping anyone. It wasn't helping me move forward, and it wasn't making me any better. So, I had to let it go. I had to accept that sometimes, doing what you have to do in a difficult situation means making hard choices and not always looking back with regret. But the emotional toll it took wasn't just about my self-image. It also affected how I saw others. That night made me a lot more cynical. I had seen how people can easily turn a blind eye when things get uncomfortable, and it made me more wary of trusting people. I became more guarded, more skeptical of people's intentions. That's not always a bad thing. Being cautious can protect you from getting hurt again, but it also made it harder for me to form real connections with people, especially when it came to relationships. I'd like to think that I'm past all of that I've moved on from those feelings of shame and confusion. But, if I'm being honest, the emotional scars are still there. They're not as visible now, but they're still part of me. And as much as I've grown and changed, I can't forget the lesson I learned from that night. Sometimes, the world isn't fair, and people won't always have your back. But that doesn't mean you can't still stand up for yourself when it matters most. And while the consequences were painful, they were also eye-opening. They taught me to be more self-aware, to examine my actions and how they're perceived by others. They also taught me that you can't control how people see you, but you can control how you react and how you carry yourself. The lesson, as hard as it was to learn, was simple: don't let others' opinions of you dictate how you see yourself. Own your decisions, even the messy ones, and don't let anyone make you feel small because of them. You're the one who has to live with your choices, and ultimately, it's up to you to find peace with them. Those were the unspoken consequences, the ones I didn't anticipate, the ones that lingered longer than I expected. But in the end, they shaped who I became, and as painful as they were, I'm thankful for the perspective they gave me. I'd be lying if I said that I didn't still think about that night from time to time. It's one of those events that stays with you, tucked in the back of your mind, waiting to resurface when you least expect it. But what I've come to understand over the years is that it wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a piece of a much bigger puzzle, one that involved my personal growth, my relationships, and my understanding of how the world works. The reality is, the way people treat you often reflects how you treat yourself. And back then, I didn't have the confidence or the self-respect that I should have had. I let things slide too often. I didn't stand up for myself enough. I let myself be caught in situations where I was uncomfortable, thinking it was easier to go with the flow rather than speak up and assert my boundaries. That night, though, forced me to re-evaluate everything. It made me realize how important it is to have boundaries, especially with the people closest to you. I've always been a people pleaser by nature, and I'm sure many of you can relate. You want to keep the peace, you want to make everyone happy, and you avoid conflict at all costs. But that's not sustainable. People will take advantage of that. They'll expect you to be the one who puts up with the nonsense, and when you finally snap, when you finally do something to protect yourself, they'll turn around and say you overreacted or that you should have handled it differently. The truth is, boundaries are not just for your own protection, they're for the protection of your relationships. When you allow people to overstep your boundaries without consequence, you're setting yourself up for resentment, anger, and frustration. I've seen it in my own relationships, whether it was with friends, family, or romantic partners. I let people cross lines, and it built up over time. That night was just the tipping point, the moment when everything came crashing down, and I had no choice but to act. It wasn't just about the woman in the bar. It was about everything that had led up to that moment, the people in my life who had never respected my boundaries, the situations I had let slide, and the way I had allowed myself to be treated. That night forced me to look at the bigger picture, to step back and realize that I had been living a life where I wasn't in control. And that needed to change. This doesn't mean I think violence is the answer. That was a mess, and I regret the way things went down. But the point is that I finally stood up for myself, and that was something I had been avoiding for years. The consequences of that night were far-reaching, but they ultimately led to a turning point in my life, one where I started to prioritize my own well-being and respect my own boundaries. I started to see things differently. I saw that I didn't have to tolerate disrespect from anyone. I didn't have to constantly apologize for asserting myself. I didn't have to shrink myself to make others feel comfortable. And that realization has stuck with me to this day. It's a core lesson that I carry with me in all aspects of my life. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this, it's this: don't wait for a moment like mine to wake up and realize that you deserve better. Don't let your boundaries be pushed until you snap. Stand up for yourself before it gets to that point. It's not just about avoiding conflict, it's about preserving your sense of self, your dignity, and your peace of mind. You are the one who has to live with yourself, so make sure you're taking care of yourself, inside and out. In the bigger picture, that night was a painful but necessary lesson. And though I wouldn't wish it on anyone, I can now say I'm grateful for the wake-up call it gave me. I wouldn't be the person I am today without it. After everything that happened that night, my relationship with my girlfriend at the time went through a significant shift. At first, I thought she would be supportive. I figured, hey, this was a crazy situation, but I handled it as best as I could. She was there, she saw what happened, and I expected her to understand. But instead, she was furious with me. Looking back now, I understand why she was upset. To her, it probably seemed like I hadn't done enough to stop the situation before it escalated. Maybe she felt embarrassed by the whole thing, or maybe she thought I should have handled it with more grace. But in the moment, I was just trying to get out of the mess. I was trying to protect myself in a situation that felt completely out of control. I won't lie, her anger hurt. It wasn't just about what happened in the bar, it was about the fact that she didn't seem to care about the fact that I was in a deeply uncomfortable position. She wasn't concerned with what I had been through or how I had felt when I was literally trapped by this woman. Instead, she was mad at me for reacting the way I did. That disconnect between us was one of the hardest things to deal with. I was looking for someone to understand my side, to stand by me, and she couldn't or wouldn't see it. In some ways, it felt like a betrayal. It felt like she was choosing to believe the worst of me instead of understanding that I had done what I thought was necessary to defend myself. But as time went on, I realized something important: people don't always react the way you want them to, especially when it comes to high-pressure situations. She didn't understand, and honestly, maybe she couldn't. We had different thresholds for what felt acceptable in those kinds of moments. The more I reflected on it, the more I realized that I couldn't hold on to that anger. Her reaction, just like mine, was a result of the chaos and confusion of the night. It wasn't personal, it was simply a misalignment of expectations. That being said, it did show me something essential about relationships. When you're in a partnership, you need someone who can see things from your perspective, especially in difficult situations. You need someone who can put themselves in your shoes and not just react based on their emotions. That was a pivotal moment in my life when I realized that relationships are about more than just being together, they're about support, trust, and understanding. The fallout from that night was the beginning of the end for us. Her inability to support me in that moment made me question the foundation of our relationship. And though we didn't break up right away, things were never the same after that. It was a slow drift, a growing realization that maybe we weren't as compatible as we thought. The emotional disconnect was too strong, and eventually, it led to us going our separate ways. That experience taught me a valuable lesson about relationships, too. It's easy to get caught up in the drama of the moment, to expect the people in your life to always react the way you think they should. But the reality is that people have their own perspectives, their own emotions, and sometimes those things don't align with yours. That doesn't make them bad people, it just means that sometimes, no matter how much you care about someone, you're not always going to see eye to eye. I learned that not every relationship is meant to last, and sometimes, the best thing you can do is accept that. Holding on to something that doesn't work can cause more pain than letting go. In the end, I wasn't meant to be with her, and she wasn't meant to be with me. We both learned from that experience, but it was clear that our paths were going in different directions. It was a hard lesson to learn, but it was necessary. If I hadn't gone through it, I wouldn't have known what to look for in future relationships, what kind of support and understanding I needed. And most importantly, I wouldn't have known what I was truly capable of when it came to standing up for myself. Sometimes, you have to go through a little heartbreak to come out stronger on the other side. And looking back, I'm grateful for the lessons, even if they came with a lot of pain. Years later, when I look back on that wild night, I can't help but laugh at how absurd everything was. At the time, I was caught up in the chaos of the moment, unsure of how to handle it, confused about my own reaction, and hurt by the people around me who didn't seem to understand. But with the passage of time, I've gained a different perspective, one that's not just about the ridiculousness of what happened, but about how it changed me in ways I couldn't have foreseen. It's easy to think that life is about avoiding awkward or uncomfortable situations, but the truth is, it's in those moments where we often learn the most about ourselves. That night was a moment I never expected, but it forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about how I saw myself and how I let others see me. For one, I learned that it's okay to take up space, to assert yourself, and to not apologize for doing so. I had spent so many years letting others push my boundaries, allowing myself to be the nice guy who just went with the flow to avoid conflict. But that night taught me that being nice shouldn't come at the expense of your own comfort and well-being. I didn't need to keep trying to please everyone around me at the cost of my own sanity. And honestly, if I hadn't reacted the way I did, I might have continued down a path where I was too passive, too willing to tolerate nonsense. That night was my wake-up call, and it was one of the best things that ever happened to me, even if it didn't feel like it at the time. I also learned about the importance of boundaries in relationships, whether it's with friends, family, or romantic partners. Before that night, I didn't really have a clear sense of what my boundaries were, and as a result, I let a lot of things slide that I shouldn't have. The way my girlfriend at the time reacted made me realize that if I wasn't firm about my own boundaries, I couldn't expect anyone else to respect them either. And that's a lesson I carried into every relationship after that one. Setting boundaries isn't just about saying no to others, it's about saying yes to yourself and making sure you don't lose yourself in the process of trying to keep the peace. In a way, I came out of that situation more confident and more self-aware. The old version of me might have stayed silent, tried to make excuses, and let everyone around me dictate what I should do. But after that night, I knew I had to take control of my own life and my own reactions. That was empowering. But most of all, I learned that people's reactions, whether it's my girlfriend, my friends, or anyone else, are often based on their own fears, insecurities, and experiences. We all have different perspectives, and we're not always going to agree. But that's okay. The real test is how you handle those differences. Do you let them tear you apart, or do you learn from them, grow from them, and use them to build a stronger version of yourself? The advice I give to anyone going through something similar is this: life is full of moments that catch you off guard. You can't always control what happens to you, but you can control how you react. Stand up for yourself, set your boundaries, and don't let anyone make you feel less than you are. Don't apologize for being uncomfortable, for standing your ground, or for defending yourself when necessary. And if people around you don't understand or don't support you, don't be afraid to walk away. You deserve respect, and you deserve to be treated with dignity, whether it's in a bar, in a relationship, or in any other part of your life. In the end, what happened that night in the bar was embarrassing, frustrating, and a bit of a disaster, but it changed my life for the better. It taught me to stop being passive, to take control of my own life, and to not apologize for being true to myself. It was a rough lesson, but one I wouldn't trade for anything. Life's messes often have a way of shaping us into stronger, more self-aware people, and that night was a perfect example of that. So, to anyone who's ever felt trapped, disrespected, or caught in a situation where you don't know how to react, take it from me, you're not alone. And when it's time to stand up for yourself, do it with everything you've got. You might be surprised at how much strength you have within you.